This week on The Sceptic, journalist Charlotte Gill joins me to look at who's really driving the public conversation and why some of those claiming to defend tolerance seem increasingly intolerant of free speech.
It is designed to shut down free speech because, if you criticise these open border charities, then you're perceived as far right, whereas their extreme left-wing agenda of seemingly no end to the amount of people we have in the UK is meant to be the default.
Author Stephen Tucker looks at the strange case of a supposed far-right terror plot that wasn't, and why some academics are now arguing that even the fear of violence is the same as actual harm.
Basically, it's another form of ism. We have racism, we have sexism, and Eventism is prejudice against things which didn't actually happen. It's privileging the real over the non-real.
And for our premium subscribers, the Daily Sceptic's environment editor, Chris Morrison, asks whether the new government's backing for more North Sea oil and gas is a genuine change of direction or just a change in rhetoric.
Who knows? He's a politician. I'm always reminded when I look at politicians, the remarks of the great comedian Groucho Marx, who said that those are my principles, sir. If you don't like them, I have others. And I think Burnham fits into that bracket.
Hello and welcome to episode 89 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast. I'm your host, Ellie Hodges. Now, Britain seems to have no shortage of taxpayer-funded campaigners and activist charities. But who's really shaping the public debate, and why do so many people claiming to stand up for tolerance seem so intolerant of free speech? Well, joining me in the studio to discuss all of that and more is journalist and Daily Sceptic contributor Charlotte Gill. Welcome, Charlotte.
Thank you for having me, Ellie.
No problem. So, firstly, you've recently written an article looking into a Guardian journalist. We can't figure out if her name is Aisha or Aisha, and her role as a senior Tarbell fellow. So for people who haven't read this article, could you kind of explain what you found out and what this is all about?
Yeah, so I saw Toby Young tweeting an exchange he'd had between himself and Aisha Down, Ms. Down, shall we say. And they were talking about how the US State Department was going to award $12 million to conservative groups in the UK, and they were saying that the Free Speech Union was going to receive $5 million. And Toby wrote back this woman, Ms. Down, wrote to Toby to ask him for right of reply. It's what we all have to do in journalism when we're writing for papers, putting the what they're going to say in the article to him, and he said, no, this is wrong. We've all the specifics are on the Daily Sceptic, but I was interested. It's not the central part of the story, but I was interested to see Ms. Down sign off as a senior Tarbell fellow. So he wasn't just being emailed from a Guardian journalist, but this Tarbell fellow. And I soon found that there's something called the Tarbell Centre for AI Journalism, a very well-funded outfit, writing to Toby Young to complain about funding potentially going towards him. And it just raised all sorts of questions about what is this, like what is Toby and the Free Speech Union? Who are they actually dealing with when they get this email?
And the Tarbell Centre have insisted that it has no editorial influence whatsoever. Is your issue with this the journalists actually being funded by them, or that the readers don't necessarily know that and it's a transparency issue?
Yeah, I think a bit of a mixture. I think, it's very well funded. A senior Tarbell fellow will get $90,000 to $110,000 per year. A very good salary for a journalist. That's the senior fellow. The lower down one is $60,000 to $80,000. And you see, because there are other examples of these outfits that are now where they have lots of different parties funding journalism, and they all say, we have editorial independence and so forth. I'm sure, these funders, they're not standing over the journalists, but there is a transparency issue, because when you look at all the funders, like even if you do a really good recce of the Tarbell Centre for AI Journalism website, you've then got to know, like, who are these funders? There's one called the Future of Life Institute. And, it sounds very nice, but who are these people? And most of them have these sort of wishy-washy names. And so you don't really know who you're dealing with. And I would, I would say that to join these organisations, you must have some sort of synchronicity of views or, I'm sure we can move on to one of my other articles where I definitely think that the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which is a partner of the Tarbell Centre for AI Journalism, and I do think you would have to have their similar views to work for that.
So tell us more about that, because that was really interesting.
Yeah, so the Bureau for Investigative Journalism recently wrote about me, and coincidentally, it is a partner. It takes on these fellows produced by the Tarbell Centre for AI Journalism, as does The Guardian. So this, I recently got this right of reply email, a bit like how Toby got emailed by Ms. Down. And they said it was called something along the lines of misinformation and abuse or targeting of City of Sanctuary UK, which is this charity. It's a bit like the Stonewall of open borders. It's trying, a bit like Stonewall tried to get lots of people to sign up to its diversity champion schemes. It's getting people to sign up to this sanctuary city scheme where you get an accreditation showing you're really nice, basically, to asylum seekers, who are now called people seeking sanctuary, according to this charity. Now, I'm probably the person that most criticises this scheme at the moment, and they don't like it, and they've got this outlet called the Bureau of Investigative Journalism has written an article about how they then became the target of far-right misinformation and abuse. It has all these scary voices, and the article sort of rolls me into descriptions of like neo-Nazis, and it's not saying that she is one or she is the far right, but it's sort of like she's in the same article, so that sort of thing. And they just don't like me criticising their projects, is the gist. And it's very well funded, this outfit that put it together, and indeed shares one funder with City of Sanctuary.
Do you think that this is actually happening more and more as well, and it's actually quite dangerous, where we have these like left-wing organisations that describe people who quite literally just criticise them as straight away being far right, or as you said, a neo-Nazi, and using that kind of language? Don't you think that's quite dangerous?
Yeah, I do think it's quite dangerous. I think one thing, people are becoming quite used to it now, though, so it doesn't have the same effect that it used to. I mean, it used to be really intimidating if Hope Not Hate or someone put you in one of their reports saying she's far right or something like that, whereas now people are like, well, you're calling everyone that. But it is, I wrote in the piece that it is designed to shut down free speech, because if you criticise these open border charities, effectively, I think they are, then you're perceived as far right, whereas their extreme left-wing agenda of seemingly no end to the amount of people we have in the UK is meant to be the default.
And you also talk about Refugee Action, which is another charity that also receives a lot of public funding. What is the significance of these charities that seem to be pushing an agenda, and do they actually have quite a lot of power?
Yes, they have. I think they have a huge amount of power. I mean, Refugee Action, the last 5 tax years have got something like over £16 million from taxpayers.
Wow.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there's one called Migrant Help, and that had about 190 million, just over that in taxpayer funding, last 5. I mean, the name just says it all. They went into schools. They had a schools programme, which they asked children about how can we welcome migrants and whatnot, and that page has now been deleted, like I found with City of Sanctuary. When I've been nosing around, they start deleting things that I put out into the public domain. There are masses of these. I mean, there are over 170,000 charities on the Commission for England and Wales alone. I've calculated about 700 million in taxpayer funding going towards charities that sort of push open borders in some form. And it's not just that they get taxpayer funds, they then get a dose of private funds on top. So they're really powerful. So it is they don't even need democracy. They don't even need to win at the ballot box, because they do all these things around the corner, or like under the radar, funding migration lawyers and things to make it easier for people to stay.
And I mean, this kind of all started, and I think it was a few months ago when, well, it was in February, obviously, when you had, I think it was one of these charities that went into a school and they were making school children write Valentine's Day cards for asylum seekers. And I think you mentioned that in your article, actually. What happened there, and why is that happening?
Yeah, so they were encouraging children to make Valentine's cards, and they used the language cards. They made it clear that these could be passed on and sent to the asylum seekers. So some people did take it extremely literally, like they thought someone was sitting around like writing dear, as in like, and then it was getting passed on to like a child was like individually giving it. But what I reported is no, they are encouraging schools to make these Valentine's cards, and then there are channels to send them on. And people didn't like that alone, But some people did, I'll admit, some people did misunderstand it. However, what the Charity Commission and City of Sanctuary have done is the Charity Commission decided that the City of Sanctuary UK was a victim of misinformation, because it said these cards were general heart-shaped messages of welcome. It's like quite a wishy-washy way of describing the fact that they were actually cards. And there were lots of other examples I found of City of Sanctuary is through its Schools of Sanctuary program, encouraging children to engage in quite political acts, writing messages to MPs and being very political. So there's a bigger, wider problem. But the Charity Commission just shut it down like disinformation. And then, so the City of Sanctuary now feels emboldened to say, this was just disinformation, and then kind of roll me in with the far right, people that got incredibly angry, and want to, rather than looking at the fact that I very accurately reported with lots of quotes and material showing exactly what was happening. And they even complain that me and this other guy who's like a conspiracy theorist or something, that we shared the list of schools involved. So it's kind of the impression you get is like, oh, they doxed them, But City of Sanctuary had a whole page on its website listing all the schools. It was really proud to show them off. It linked to their websites, and, it was like, here, you can find them, go to their website. They just didn't like it when they didn't get the right publicity. They thought no one was ever going to criticise it.
And do you think these charities actually ever come under enough scrutiny?
No, not at all. I think more now. I think the word is really getting out about, and things like comic relief and children in need, and people being more concerned about where those grants are going to. National Lottery, which I've found to be a hellhole in terms of some of the stuff it funds. So I think the word is getting out, but I think they really are still allowed to do whatever they want, really. The Charity Commission, which is just useless. I mean, this commission has got to regulate, like I say, like over 170,000 charities in England and Wales alone, a small commission. So how can they possibly do that? But they also have very vague rules about political campaigning. I mean, if you have a charity, the rules are basically like, you cannot campaign, you cannot be party political. So you can't say like, I love reform, or which no one in the charity sector ever would, but you can't say like, I love Zach Polanski. But you're basically allowed to be as political as you want. The rules are just really chilled. So and also a lot of charities have ways of circumventing it, like Hope Not Hate, whose charity is now called Hope Unlimited Charitable Trust. They, the private wing does all the lobbying against people like Susan Hall, the Conservative, and it gets funded by the charity wing. So they can say, well, it was our private wing, so we can do what we want politically, but the charity is supplying all the income.
And what kind of rules would you introduce, or would you kind of keep it how it is? Because it's kind of hard to decide what you would actually do.
Yeah, I would scrap taxpayer funding for charities.
Yeah.
And to add, I think there are many amazing small charities like really cash-strapped ones. So I think there should be some taxpayer funding for those. But the system is so out of control. I almost think just like... I was about to say burn it down. Don't burn it down. Just scrub everything and just start. But take away... Most people think their contributions are voluntary.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just crazy. I'm sure there's all sorts of other tax rules that people could get into. I know a lot of people don't like gift aid, and they don't like how people use charity sometimes to avoid tax. I mean, things that you just would have no idea a charity are set up as a charity. So the whole system needs a giant reform, But yeah, just the small team at the Charity Commission, the idea that they can regulate this monster is just, bearing in mind, it's not just that we have ideological problems in the charity sector, but they're also meant to be looking into like fraud, evasion, like trustees. The amount of stuff they're meant to regulate is you need like a Elon Musk style Doge team to get the grip of it.
I mean, it's a massive rabbit hole, I think, that you could just keep going down, and I'd recommend people to... What is your Substacks?
It's at charlottecgill.co.uk.
Yeah, I definitely recommend people to subscribe to that, because you've done some really good work. And if we kind of bring that on to this new world of journalism, because everything has changed so much now, and people can do much more now because of the advent of social media and build up their platforms in that way. How do you see this kind of new journalism landscape, and how do you think it's going to progress?
Difficult one. I think Substack, the meritocracy element of Substack is brilliant.
Yes.
I think it's really exciting, all the new independent journalists we're seeing. I really horrified my three brothers by describing it a bit like OnlyFans, because it's like it's a kind of pyramid model. Like few make it to the top, but then they're really well people at the top of the Substack model are making a lot of money, but then most people are at the bottom, like OnlyFans. So a lot of people think
it's quite true, actually.
Yeah, they think, oh, I can do it. I want to give it a go, but you've really got to have a niche. I guess my other slight concern about like journalism and the way it's changing is like, I think people still have to be very carefully legally about what they say. And sometimes, and I write like very carefully worded. And sometimes people kind of, I think people use shorthands and like kind of express things in quite dramatic ways that aren't always accurate, but then they get more views. And then that kind of goes into a Chinese whispers. I don't want to say disinformation. I would never say that word, but I think people have to be careful in that respect, because now it spreads quite a lot, and you want to be really accurate.
I mean, what do you think about the current state of the mainstream media? Do you think it's kind of dying out?
I mean, they still are very well funded, a lot of them. But then you do see The Guardian having that sort of fellowship, so you wonder how that's all set up. I think the mainstream, and I do poo-poo it sometimes, but they also do incredible stories and research stuff that, I have no idea about. Like, I'm learning loads from them. But I think it just comes down to funders in the end and things like that. Like, why are there some stories they don't really want to touch? Is that because, and I've had this experience, like you take the story to an editor, they really like it, then they go off and they've spoken to someone who said, no, I don't want to go there. And that could be for any number of reasons, not necessarily because they're involved, but maybe they don't really want journalists kind of nosing around those areas, because then they'd be a hypocrite. I don't know. I have no idea. But sometimes you find that there's like a ceiling where you can't hit. And also it's just sometimes the mainstream media has stupid rules in it. Like they really have had a thing about things being London centric. Yeah. And so they that's one of their stupid rules. Like they're like, oh, it's a bit like, because obviously they have to apply to the whole of the country. They have to be sort of the Andy Burnham of the newspaper world. Yes. But people still find London really interesting, especially because it's sort of like a petri dish for what could happen elsewhere. So I think you find these sort of arbitrary rules sometimes. And yeah, I don't know. This is why I like being freelance, because you never have anyone that's saying, no, you can't do that.
It's good. It's good. I mean, speaking about things not being London-centric, we've had Andy Burnham now in for 2 weeks, I want to say. How do you think he's done so far?
I just find him cringe. He just seems to think that he just kind of thinks he likes Oasis and the Smiths or whatever and football, so he's really cool, and we're meant to be impressed with that and his new office. And but he's certainly got a rubbish team behind him, like Matthew McGregor, who I recently wrote about for the Daily Sceptic, who's this Hope Not Hate former campaigns director. I think the fact that he's the director of political strategy is going to be a nightmare if he gets any of his ideas through, because he just came from this organisation called 38 Degrees that is extraordinarily radical. I mean, it funds the Good Law Project. It's listed as a supporter. They are, they're on the same spectrum page rather as Zach Polanski. It's like very green woke agenda. And and I wrote about for Daily Sceptic like some of the things that he'd said, and he just seems pretty ghastly.
Do you think that his government will actually be quite radically left-wing or not? Because when you speak to some people, they say, oh, he's coming across as quite centrist, and he's working with the Conservatives and the Lib Dems now, having meetings with them about the changes he's making to the care system. Do you think that that's actually what this government's going to be like, or do you think it actually could be quite left-wing?
He's really similar to Matthew McGregor, his director of political strategy, in that if you talk to them, McGregor, he's a very softly spoken, very reasonable guy. You feel like you could have a nice chat with him at the pub, but then what he's saying is very radical. He sort of talks about how disclosing the ethnicity and immigration status of crime suspects is like a concession to the far right. He loves Mamdani. He thinks reform are dastardly and supervillains and all these really extreme things, but he sounds very nice. So is Andy Burnham a bit like that? We'll have to see.
We will have to see. And do you think the Conservatives might actually bounce back by the time the next general election comes around?
Potentially. I do think we need to see an alignment on the right, though, because I hope I'm wrong and I'm just worrying too much about all these left-wing factions, but they're creating all their progressive alliances and coalitions, and they're really good at overcoming obstacles and differences. You see that with the Greens and sort of Muslim independence and Corbyn coming together because they agree on Israel/Gaza.
Yeah.
And we're just fighting constantly on the right, and I think there's going to have to be some sort of working together, otherwise there's not going to be enough. Unless reform really get into gear and start getting policies out and start re-strategizing, which I don't think they're doing enough of at the moment, because they're too on the back foot with all these Times scandals and reports and
Lastly, speaking about the Green Party, I'm not sure if you've done any investigation into the party, but I do think a lot of people find it quite bizarre how you've got kind of this LGBTQ plus section of the Green Party along with very conservative Muslims, and they've kind of come together, as you said, because the Israel-Palestine issue. I mean, do you think that will kind of crumble away?
I do think eventually. It kind of makes me think a bit of Andy Burnham and how he's trying to placate all these red-green groups, and he thinks he'll keep them happy, but then they'll eat him eventually, I think, because it will be the most radical wins. And I think the Muslim vote, they do actually, there's actually an account online called that, like they do sometimes refer to themselves as that, are just seeing the Greens as a useful partnership for now. It's working. Also, your party, because Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana had a teaming up with the Muslim independents. But could they dispose of them in the future? Yeah, I mean, probably, because it's not compatible. You see there have been Muslim protesters against schools teaching the woke curriculum or whatever, and obviously that's not going to work, the socially conservative element. So the joke's on the Greens if that doesn't work out.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Now, we were told, a recent far-right terror plot targeting 15,000 Muslims gathered at Shrubland Hall in Suffolk, condemned by the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary and campaign groups alike. Only problem, it doesn't seem to have actually existed. Everyone arrested walked free, and yet almost nobody who sounded the alarm has taken it back. It's a story that ties into something my next guest has written about before. An academic theory claiming that just fearing violence counts as having experienced it. Well, to discuss all of that, I'm joined now by author and Daily Sceptic regular Stephen Tucker. Welcome, Stephen.
Hello, thanks for having me on. Nice to be here.
Thank you for joining me. So let's start with this incident at Shrubland Hall in Suffolk. For anyone who missed it, what was the far-right terror plot we were told about, and what actually happened when the arrest played out?
Well, in a word, nothing. There was no event there, basically. It was almost a pseudo-event. It was meant to be a large gathering of about 15,000 people in the Suffolk countryside at a place called Burnham, and they were supposed to be there on behalf of an organisation called Taglibi Al-Jamaat, and they are alleged in various other countries to be extremists, supposedly. And so some people were slightly concerned about this event, even though there was not really anything particularly bad going on there. It was perfectly peaceful and just a general religious gathering as far as we can tell. However, the police descended and they actually advised the organisers to cut the event short because there was a credible and serious threat of terrorism and loss of life, supposedly. So it was cut short. It had to finish about 7 o'clock in the morning, whereas it should have finished at about 7 o'clock at night. And this was reported in the media as, an apparent terror threat. So that's what most people will have heard about. However, several arrests were made across the country, which sounds bad initially. 8 people under the terms of the Terrorism Act 2000 and 4 people along other lines, including suspicion of attempts at murder and that kind of stuff, which sounds very serious. And there the story for most people probably will have ended because they might not have heard that within a couple of days, everyone, bar one exception, which was a little bit aberrant and misleading, had been released. And quite what actually happened, it's not been officially confirmed, but what appears to have occurred is that some people from, as they style it, a kind of patriot group, who style themselves as protectors of the public, they'd gone there armed, not with any weapons, but just with a couple of drones and gone to a nearby field. And they appear to have flown them over the field just to monitor these people to see what they're up to, Are they secretly doing terrorist training camps? Are you going to get footage of them stripping and then reassembling Kalashnikovs? Well, no, you're just actually going to get footage of them walking around talking to each other, it seems. But that's what they were up to. Far from being far-right terrorists, as was presented, they were people who were actually trying to, in their terms, as they saw it, stop an act of terrorism from occurring. It was a non-existent act of terrorism, but they weren't actually terrorists themselves in any way, shape or form. They were more like a little bit like fantasists. In the article, I compared them to Uncle Jimmy from Reginald Perrin sitcoms in the 1970s, who he set up his own kind of self-defense force, amateur self-defense force to defend Britain from fifth columnists within. So they were really kind of just fantasists. But to be fair to the police, initially, they were dressed in camouflage type gear and they did have, mask type coverings over the faces. So it warranted investigation, but there was a massive overreaction with all these people being arrested across the country, because ultimately nothing happened. And some people, like Richard Tice from Reform UK, put two and two together and thought, well, is this just some kind of plot to distract from the murder of Anne Widdecombe, which allegedly, no one knows, but it's popularly perceived that it might have been motivated by some kind of left-wing cause, although, again, that's just speculation on Tice's behalf. And he thought maybe the police could have been doing this deliberately in order to distract from that. So that's the general idea there. But quite what the truth is, it seems to have been basically a complete pseudo-event, something out of nothing. But most people will only have heard about the alleged event to begin with, which was widely reported in the media, and not the subsequent retraction to the effect that actually there was nothing much to see here, just some fantasists with a couple of drones with cameras on.
And the Home Secretary said the police undoubtedly saved lives, and the PM called it a credible, serious threat. Given everyone's now been released without terror charges, why do you think none of those politicians have walked that language back?
Well, there are a couple of potential reasons. The first one is most likely simple embarrassment, because if you look at what they said, as you say, it's correct. He said this is a credible and serious threat, or variations with that language. It's undoubtedly saved many lives. If the Prime Minister, in fact, both Prime Ministers that we had that week, in terms of Keir Starmer and Andy Burnham, are saying this, and if the Home Secretary is saying this, and if various other MPs like Hannah Spencer of the Green Party are saying this, and all the media are coming out and very, very clearly saying this is a credible threat, this is something which is really definitely going to happen, there were definitely going to be lives taken, and it just turns out to have been a few kind of like dress-up fantasists with a camera on a drone, then that would be rather embarrassing. And considering that this government is so keen upon combating misinformation, as it always puts it, they could clearly be accused themselves of promulgating disinformation, couldn't they? So that would be rather humiliating for them. And the same, really, in many respects for the media, because if you look at an awful lot of the reports there was one in specifically from, I think it was ITV News on their website. They took a quote from the Muslim Council of Britain about this, saying, Muslim Council of Britain declare, far-right threat against Muslims is real, not imagined. Can you imagine if that was the actual headline? Can you imagine if they've had to put out a subsequent correction saying, sorry, actually that's a complete misprint. We should have said the threat in this case from the far-right is imagined, not real. I mean, that would have been a completely humiliating correction for them, wouldn't it, really? So I think it's very much to do with that. And potentially, as Richard Tice says, it could have been an attempt to reframe the narrative away from potential far-left terrorism or killing, if that's indeed what happened with Anne Widdecombe. However, there may also be a slightly more sinister interpretation of why they haven't rolled back on these statements, apart from sheer embarrassment and apart from being accused of hypocrisy when it comes to misinformation.
And you highlight the Muslim Council of Britain and the Public and Commercial Services Union, both putting out statements insisting the threat was real regardless of the outcome. What does it tell you when an organisation says it stands by its members, whether threatened or real?
Well, there are two interpretations of that as well. I mean, one of them slightly more benign and one of them rather less so. If we begin with the first one, you could just say it's like safetyism gone mad, like, pandering to people's emotions and so forth. If people feel there's a threat, well, if they're threatened, let's mollify them. But if you look at what the PCS, the union's actual statement was, I have it here somewhere. It was the PCS is ready to support our members from events, whether threatened or real. And you have to ask, well, why would someone need protection from threats which genuinely aren't real, which are imagined? And I think that if you look at a lot of the other interviews in the media, there was one in The Independent with an imam who attended the event, and this was after this interview ran. After it was probably quite clear that there wasn't much to it, and he was saying, well, even though there was nothing that happened, I still felt scared. So the threat itself is enough to terrify Muslims. There was one, an interview, a very, very sycophantic and almost dimmified interview on an ITV News, quite a large filmed segment, in which a man, and again another attendee at the UKH Teamer event, he was basically allowed to just stand there and say, well, if this had come off, it could have been the biggest terror attack in all British history, not just against Muslims, but against anyone. And look at all those conditional verbs used there. If, could, maybe. Well, again, they're kind of privileging imagined events over ones which haven't occurred. Because nonetheless, even though they didn't happen, the prospect of them happening, the very idea that it might have occurred, still had a genuine effect, they say, upon the emotions of these vulnerable imams and vulnerable Muslim attendees. Now, again, you could just say, oh, well, maybe they're being nice and pandering to their emotions. It's just another example of safetyism. But actually, there is a more sinister interpretation, because if you look at the subsequent argument that the Muslim Council of Britain and others then build atop that, it's basically that, well, because people are scared, we still demand action anyway. Okay, no one was actually killed, although the Muslim Council of Britain have not since come out and have really admitted that there was no threat. But just because there was no literal threat, just because people felt threatened, we still need physical actions to take place. So they wrote to the statement addressing the new Prime Minister, as did Hannah Spencer from the Greens, saying, well, these threats are still credible because there is still such a thing as a far-right threat against Muslims, so we demand concrete action. So there's a kind of contrast there, isn't there? Imaginary event didn't occur. What must the policy result be? Concrete action. And what would concrete action in this case actually constitute? You have to presume it'd be yet more restrictions upon free speech in terms of anti-Islamophobia laws, kind of blasphemy type laws by the back door, that kind of thing. So I think this is why they're focusing upon this. I mean, you almost get the sense they were desperate for it to be a real terror event, because then they could ask for as many actions as they like. But, well, let's make the best of this anyway. There wasn't something real there. But let's just say, well, the emotional effect is real, so please give us more and more real consequences. But, of course, this wouldn't work the other way around necessarily. I mean, there are plenty of people who feel threatened by Islam, and there isn't, sometimes there aren't necessarily genuine terror threats in every area, but people still feel scared by it. So are they still allowed to petition the Prime Minister for anti-Islam laws or mass deportation or closing the borders or anything like that? That would be considered to be illegitimate, because majority groups' fears, no, they don't exist, they're not real. Whereas the fears of minority groups are always privileged. So their fear is legitimate and our fear is not, even though realistically the actual greater threat in real terms is Islamism and not the far right.
And you use the term Eventism in this piece. You'd actually written about that concept a few days earlier for us in a completely different context. What does Eventism mean, and where does it come from?
Well, it's not a term that I've invented. Sadly, it's not a real thing, but people think it's a real thing. It's a real concept, which comes, as you probably can guess, from academia, or what passes for kind of pseudo-academia these days, namely the general field of critical studies, like race studies or queer studies, that kind of thing, and specifically trauma studies. And basically, it's another form of ism. We have racism, we have sexism, we have all kinds of isms, and eventism is prejudice against things which didn't actually happen. So it's privileging the real over the non-real. So in this specific instance, you have people like me who might say, well, there was no terror event. There was just some fantasists with a drone with a camera on it. There was no event. People like the Muslim Council of Britain or eventists may say, well, that's just another form of prejudice. Who are you to be able to define what an event was? It was an event to us because it scared us. There was nothing physical that happened, no bomb was dropped from on top of the drones onto the gathered crowd. No vials of acid or biological weapons were dropped from it. So even though there was no event there, it still scared us. This could have happened, so you're being prejudiced against us. There's a specific example which might be able to illustrate this in an academic paper, which we'll probably discuss later, where one scholar talked about the idea of a stabbing in inverted commas. Well, what would an act of violence or like a stabbing be in inverted commas? Well, it would be a stabbing or an act of violence which hasn't actually physically taken place. You've just kind of anticipated or imagined that it might. And the scholar says this is very difficult to convince people that it's really happened, as it hasn't, because there's no wound, there's no visible wound. So how do you convince someone that this stabbing, which hasn't occurred, has occurred? Because there's no wound for it, which, I mean, it doesn't really make much sense, but it's kind of almost the reverse of what happened with Henry Novak, where there was a white boy who was stabbed and he did have a wound, and he was pleading to the police, please, I've been stabbed. And they said, well, no, you haven't, mate. So that's kind of almost like reverse eventism in process, because what eventists are, people who believe in eventism, say is majority groups like, say, whites like Henry Novak have the ability to arbitrarily define what reality is because they have the power in society. So he's lying there on the floor saying, I've been stabbed. He's privileging the idea of a physical wound over the idea of an imaginary wound, like the Sikh people had the imaginary wound of his imaginary racist insults, which they claimed he'd made against them, but he hadn't. And the police have almost been indoctrinated into this. They won't know the term eventism, they'll just know it as anti-racism or something like that. But they've been privileged to believe, it would appear, the minority group, the Sikh in that case, and his imaginary complaints about an imaginary psychic wound of being insulted, whereas they'll have been also conversely trained not to believe almost, or not to privilege the actual factual physical wound of Henry Novak, who had been stabbed. So basically that's what eventism is. It's turning things upside down in terms of physical reality, as happened at the Ijtima event, really.
And that earlier piece looked at an academic paper arguing that merely anticipating violence, like rape or assault, should count as violence having already occurred. Can you walk us through what that paper actually claims?
Yeah, well, it was a 2025 paper from some kind of Canadian queer studies authors. There were three of them. Celestine E.R. was the lead author, I think. And it was called Defining Anticipatory Violence as Violence. And basically, it just says, if you expect, or if you're from a minority group, and you expect some kind of violence to occur to you, then in effect, it already has. So they used an example of a transgender brown-skinned person who anticipates walking down the street and perhaps getting assaulted or sexually assaulted or stabbed or whatever. The paper's not specifically just about sexual assault. It's about violence of all kinds, from murder to shooting to stabbing to rape to whatever. But this individual, as far as I'm aware, has never actually been stabbed or mugged or assaulted or raped or anything for simply being trans and non-white. However, because he anticipates it happening in the future, to them, it's already happened. Because what they would say is, if there's someone from a minority group who anticipates violence happening to them, well, why do they anticipate violence actually happening to them? It's because it's happened to other people from the minority group in the past. So perhaps another transgender person has been brutally raped for being just transgender at some point. So they're saying their fear of this means that in effect it's already happened, which ties into one of the scholars in this paper is an expert on something called trans time or crip time, which basically says that time, as you or I know it, which moves forward, it is basically a white racist heteronormative power concept, and that therefore minority groups might experience time in different ways. So, for example, in another article I wrote about there was a person who was a 56-year-old man physically, chronologically, but inside he was a 9-year-old child or a 6-year-old child or whatever. So his body had a racist chronology maybe, or a transphobic chronology, but his mind, that was the real thing. So in this instance, trans time or crypt time could be interpreted as meaning just because an act of violence or hypothetical violence has happened in the future, as in you or I would think, well, that means it hasn't happened then, hasn't it? But in this extremely bizarre concept, it would mean that because you're anticipating it happening, it already has happened. So to them, it would not be a contradiction in terms to say, to perhaps walk into a police station and say, hello, officer, I've just been raped 10 years in the future, and expect this to be taken seriously. But I mean, how can you do that? It's like a future crime, a bit like that Minority Report, that sci-fi film where you have psychics who see into the future and they arrest people for crimes which occur in 10 years' time. It's a bit like that. So again, with this UK-ish teamer idea, taking this as the idea, it could be a bit like, well, there wasn't a terror attack against us this time, but, who's to say that this attack won't occur next time around? So basically what these people in the paper attempt to do, it's an attempt to libel almost majority groups as being guilty of crimes which they have never personally committed. Because, if I said, honestly, I've never murdered anyone, I've never once killed a single Muslim or a single transgenderist, I'm completely innocent of that, well, they might say, well, how do we know you haven't done that 20 years' time? And also, they want to kind of redefine what violence is in the first place. You'd think violence would be very easy to define, and that's what the scholars initially say, because, shooting someone in the head, that sounds violent. Stabbing someone in the neck, that sounds violent as well. But what about redefining violence? What about microaggressions? Aren't they violence as well? Well, just for instance, asking, say, an immigrant, oh, where are you from? Which might count as a microaggression to them. That doesn't really sound the same as just kicking them down the stairs and stamping on their head, does it? But they'd say, but that kind of microaggression environment which you were helping create, that in its tiny way contributes to the gigantic matrix which ultimately leads towards genocide of trans people and Jews and black people and Muslims and everyone. So you might think you're not guilty, but really you are. So it's almost like a kind of collective blood libel against people. And again, you can actually see this in action with events only over the other few days when there was a terror attack in Germany, wasn't there, where someone appears to have driven a car into a crowd and stabbed people at a gay parade. And you'd think that the people to blame to this would be radical Islamists, because the man who apparently did this and was then shot dead by the police later whilst seemingly rushing at them with some kind of weapon, well, he said he appears to have done this in the name of Islam. So you think the logical thing to do would be, well, let's blame Islam for this. And yet various Labour MPs, and indeed Friedrich Merz over in Germany, they've actually preferred to blame GB News and people like me, I suppose, for perhaps criticising excesses of queer studies and that kind of thing, rather than Islam, because we have contributed in our own tiny way with microaggressions towards an environment in which this man might then have gone out and stabbed people. So rather than blaming the actual guilty person for the event, why not libel people who had nothing whatsoever to do with it as being more guilty of the event instead? So it makes no sense, really, logically speaking, but that's basically what they're saying.
So bringing those two stories together then, what's the link between an academic redefining rape so it no longer requires an actual rape and a terror plot that never actually existed? It feels like the same mindset at work, where the facts matter less than who gets to define them. And how can ordinary people push back when the story becomes more important than the event itself?
Well, I think what draws them together is basically the attempt to... it's a power play, essentially. It's an attempt to make the guilty into the oppressed and the innocent into the oppressors, and to make it logically or illogically impossible for the innocent to defend themselves. So it is very much an illogical power play. And in terms of how to defend yourself from it, well, there are a number of tactics. I mean, one way you can do it is simply by mocking these people, because, I mean, these ideas are almost mentally ill in nature, aren't they? I mean, that's what I tried to do in my articles to some degree, because, I did make jokes about them. And if you tease out their logic, it's very much anti-logic, and it's stupid. I mean, if you use reductio ad absurdum things like "Hello, officer, I've been raped in 10 years in the future," then, I mean, that will tend to provoke laughter amongst people. So you could use that as a tactic to fight back against it. Or, alternatively, you could point out the real life consequences. Bring up Henry Novak again. Say that's eventism in practice. Do you really want this? Do you want the police letting a boy who's had something physically done wrong to him bleed to death on the floor, whilst privileging someone whose wounds are utterly imaginary? I imagine all the innocent people who could be arrested if this is taken to its logical conclusion for, "Hello, sir, you've committed a crime," in inverted commas. Well, I haven't done anything. Yeah, well, that just proves it then, doesn't it? So, I mean, that's the stupid logic here. So you can kind of come out with that. However, the problem is, if you are arguing directly with these people, whilst you might be able to persuade the audience, you wouldn't necessarily be able to persuade them themselves, because by definition, they don't privilege logic. They think that logic itself, like time, is a heteronormative white imperialist construct. So if you tell them, "Well, your argument just doesn't make sense," and then prove it, it's well, that's racist. But I want an illogical argument. Can you prove your case illogically instead? Which, again, to a rational audience member would just make them look insane. But in terms of them themselves, they wouldn't necessarily see that. So, I mean, I think the best tactic is just expose these people. I mean, unfortunately, the media don't seem to be terribly keen on doing that. But if these people ever do actually agree to debate you, it should be quite easy to logically defeat them to the satisfaction of the average, normal-brained observer. The trouble is, they themselves are not normal-brained, and in fact, some of them speak of another form of prejudice called saneism, in which privileging sanity over insanity is, again, another form of bigotry. So you can't defeat them themselves to their own internal mental satisfaction, because you're arguing from completely different premises. It's a bit like that old Wittgenstein thing about, even if a lion could speak, we'd never be able to understand it. If they're speaking on deliberately illogical, insane terms, then you're speaking on logical, sane terms, and you can't defeat them. But you can perhaps hopefully defeat them in the eyes of the wider public before they're also converted towards going insane, which hopefully won't happen. So that's the best I can do in terms of this. I think mock them would be the best idea.
Stephen Tucker, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Okay, thank you very much. Nice to be on. Good to be on again.
Now, our new Prime Minister is talking about backing more North Sea oil and gas. But does that signal a genuine shift in Britain's energy policy, or is it just a change in tone? Well, to discuss all of that, I'm joined by the Daily Sceptic's environment editor, Chris Morrison. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, Ellie. Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Very good to have you with us, Chris. Now, Andy Burnham's saying some very different things about North Sea oil and gas now. Do you think he's genuinely changed his mind, or is this just politics?
Who knows? He's a politician. I'm always reminded when I look at politicians, the remarks of the great comedian Groucho Marx, who said that those are my principles, sir. If you don't like them, I have others. And I think Burnham fits into that bracket from what we've seen in his weeks long premiership. To be serious, we just don't know because until recently, certainly 2024, 2025, he was a supporter of the Climate and Nature Bill, which was a dreadful, abominable neo-Marxist Trojan horse that has been around for some time. Caroline Lucas tried to introduce it into the House of Commons when she was an MP, and it recently had a second party reading last January. And 200 MPs in this parliament were prepared to support it. And that included 90 Labour MPs, all of the Greens, all of the Lib Dems, of course, and a couple of crackpot Tories who presumably are undergoing sympathetic re-education under the Badenoch regime, Simon Hoare and Sir Roger Gale. And the point of this bill, if you look closely and work out what it actually says, it would reduce the use of hydrocarbons, both international and local. That means anything that's made of hydrocarbons or causing emissions from using hydrocarbons would come under this internationally and domestically. And it was reduced to reduced down to 10% within a decade. Now that would lead to societal collapse. There simply wouldn't be enough energy to run emergency services almost. And it gets worse than that, of course, because what these people never seem to realise is that hydrocarbons are used in everything else. Plastics, medicines. For instance, paracetamol, common painkiller around the world, is based on using hydrocarbons. Many sophisticated cancer drugs are based on using hydrocarbons. Fertilizer, which has doubled crop yields around the world, and has doubled and has led to a significant increase in crop yields in this country, would be essentially banned within 10 years. We would have half our food because we wouldn't even be able to import food from overseas because they use fertilizers. This was what was being proposed. And this, to my mind, would lead to death, starvation, societal collapse, everything. Now, in the story I've just written in the Daily Sceptic about this, I point to three reasons why these MPs, now including, it seems, Andy Burnham, might go for it. One is rank stupidity. And one can only say, as I did in the piece, that if the IQ scores were any lower, you would have to consider seriously taking them out to be watered.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.